is an honor to be here to talk with you all, to tell you a little bit more about William Grimes that we didn't know since the 2008 edition of the Grimes narrative came out. So today, I am not going to necessarily tell you about my journey to discover William Grimes. I want to do a couple of different things. There's new information about William Grimes that has not been shared in print that I'd like to tell you about. Yes, I am deeply connected to William Grimes. It has been my mission to have his story widely accessible. Now, I am the third great-granddaughter of William Grimes on my mother's maternal side. And again, that journey's for another day. You can learn all about my personal journey to discover this narrative in the film that is now being screened on Prime Video called Gina's Journey, The Search for William Grimes. So today you're going to get an overview about William Grimes. Then I'll talk a little bit about how precedent setting this narrative is. I'll talk about my relationship with Professor William L. Andrews, who really is the one that has taught me so much about the Grimes narrative. And again, I'm going to try to put William Grimes front and center, or in the heart of the Yale and New Haven community. Bear with me, I am not all that savvy with Zoom, so hopefully you'll be able to follow along should I make a mistake or something. So what you see on the screen now is a page from a family Bible that has been in my family for decades. Now, my family didn't know that they had William Grimes as an ancestor. We knew nothing about him except a little comment that my Aunt Catherine had given me about a gentleman named Grimes from New Haven who was somehow associated with the Underground Railroad. And as I carried that little story with me for decades, actually, because I was a child when I first heard about him, she also told me that there was a family Bible. She didn't know where it was. And my mother had convinced me that this Bible was long gone, and other elders in the family thought it was mythical, that it never existed. Well, it did exist. And in front of you, you see one page, and it's the page that has recorded all of the death records. And if you can follow the cursor, in fact, I'm going to make this a laser pointer so that you can really see. Here's the death date of William Grimes, noted as August 21st, 1865. So this was the first jewel in the crown that I would come upon that would solidify a connection with William Grimes. And one other reason why I was able to connect him immediately to the family is that in his narrative, he notes his wife's name as being the lovely and all-accomplished Clarissa Caesar. Well, as you can see here, Clarissa Grimes, she was Caesar originally, and then we have other pages in the Bible that states her name as Clarissa Caesar, her birth record. So anyway, this set me on a course that I'm still on, actually. Just one moment. I'm trying to get to the next screen here. And why? Oh, there we go. I'm just not pressing hard enough. Okay, William Grimes was born in King George, Virginia in 1784. He was born 1 year after the American Revolutionary War ended. He was born in a land boasting its freedom and equality, yet he was born a slave. He states that very sarcastically in the opening of his narrative. His father, Benjamin Grimes, was a wealthy white planter of Eagle's Nest, and his mother was an enslaved Black woman, still remains unknown. So William Grimes was actually the property of Dr. Stewart, who lived on a neighboring plantation to his father. Now, this goes to show you how complicated the slave system was, because William Grimes, even though he was the son of this white planter, he was owned by Dr. Stewart. In the slave states, the children follow the condition or status of their mother. So William Grimes' mother was enslaved to Dr. Stewart, and that meant that he was as well. He was 10 years old when he was sold away from the arms of his grieving mother to a far off plantation in what was then Culpeper County. His new owner was Colonel William Thornton, who was the brother-in-law of Dr. Stewart. William grew up like a wild weed. He had no surrogate enslaved family to embrace him, and he was on a plantation where he knew no one. He talked about being brutalized at a very young age. And I won't go into all of that, but his narrative reads so harshly. His life is just unbearable. It reeks of blood of gore and gore. It's just brutal. So William Grimes grew up to be a rebellious slave. Again, he had 10 owners, 4 from Virginia, all from the Stewart and Thornton line, and 6 from Savannah, Georgia. And those who owned him in Savannah, Georgia, were all interconnected. There were 6 men who owned him in Savannah, and they all were in business together with the cotton industry and so forth. So they all had a hand in utilizing William Grimes for different reasons. A coachman, mainly a coachman, actually. He also worked in urban Savannah as on the plantations as well. But for the most part, these men in Savannah were interconnected in really interesting ways. A couple of them were from New England. A couple of them, one was directly from Connecticut. But anyway, by 1815, he escaped slavery as he hides among bales of cotton on a brig that will take him to New York City. Once he arrived in New York, he was spotted by a previous owner, a 6th owner by the name of Oliver Sturgis. So that quickly prompted him to make his way to New Haven. And once he got to New Haven, let's understand that he was actually tormented. And when I say tormented, I mean because he was always living in fear of being found out. He was constantly looking over his shoulder. He crisscrossed all over New England whenever he thought his master was hot on his trail. Surely this same state of fear, I believe, lives in the undocumented people today. Well, soon after he arrived in New Haven, he began working with the Lanson brothers. And Of course, that name is paramount in the history of New Haven. The Lanson brothers were African American entrepreneurs who did extraordinary things for the community. And William Grimes found work with them right away. I don't know whether it was word of mouth that got him to be in touch with them, but we do know that they were in touch, um, because he states that in his narrative. So again, William Grimes, he crisscrosses all over New England, especially when he's looking for job opportunity as well. But for the most part, he doesn't seem to settle down because he's always got that constant fear looming over his shoulders. So he returns to New Haven and he begins working at Yale College. And he also works at the Litchfield Law School in Litchfield. Those are his two main sources of incomes. He finds consistent work in those educational environments. And of course, you all know in New Haven and in Litchfield, they were intellectual hubs. They were educational centers. And William Grimes was, to me, like a sponge, always looking and learning and absorbing as much as he can. He was paying attention. The first time we see William Grimes in newspaper print is when he marries in 1817. He marries Clarissa Caesar, who is the daughter of Timothy Caesar, who was a Revolutionary War patriot. This union would produce lots of children, 18 in total. So if you've fallen asleep on my presentation, I know you're awake now because the numbers are unreal. They would have 12 that would make it to adulthood. But William Grimes, by this time when he's starting his family, he is in Litchfield. He found out that there was a barber needed in that area. And Litchfield was sort of what he called the back country. So he felt safer there because he didn't feel that he would be in that hub of New Haven where he could conceivably be spotted. But he does pretty good in Litchfield. He buys property from a famous furniture maker. He is cutting the hair of the governor. He is shaving and grooming the men at the law school. But for whatever reason, that wasn't enough for William Grimes. We find him back in New Haven. I'm trying to advance this screen. We find him in 1823 back in New Haven. He rents his house out in Litchfield and he goes into business with a gentleman by the name of Thomas Manny. And what is really interesting here is that he is still a fugitive on the run. This ad will put him front and center it's like a permanent situation. It's in print. His owner could easily find him because of this ad. So this ad may have facilitated his recapture, although I can't be sure of that. What I do know is that at least 3 of the 6 men who owned him in Savannah, they were out looking for him. The next time we see William Grimes in print will be for another remarkable reason. And I'll get to that in a moment, but I want you to know that this ad was a risky move for him to make. Certainly he should have been more inconspicuous and under the radar, but he went into business, and the business, if you can look up here, was on a stand on State Street opposite the Family Flour Store, flour spelled Flour. So down at the bottom, so they've got this laundry business going on, but down at the bottom, you see Mr. Grimes shaves and cuts hair at the above place. So again, I tell you that it was a risky move. And William Grimes, he certainly should have known that. And he wrote this about being identified. So I'm going to take this straight out of his narrative. He said, I was often recognized by students and others from the South, and my master knew where I was. I thought if I went back in the country, meaning Litchfield, if I was taken up, I should have more chance to buy myself free. I therefore returned to Litchfield. Mr. Burroughs from the South had before this seen me in New Haven and said my master would send on for me. I got a gentleman in Litchfield to write my master to know what he would do, and he wrote back that he would take $500 for me, though I was worth $8. So this Mr. Burroughs that William Grimes is talking about actually is Benjamin Burroughs, a man William Grimes had been hired out to in Savannah by his sixth master, Oliver Sturgis. And remember earlier I told you that this Oliver Sturgis saw William Grimes in New York. Francis Wellman was William Grimes's 10th master. I don't know whether there's a newspaper ad for a runaway slave that Wellman put out there that has yet to surface. But one thing is very evident is that at least 3 men, Burroughs, Sturgis, and Bullock, were out looking for William Grimes. And I also learned from this that the boundaries between the North and the South weren't rigid. These Northerners were going south to engage in the cotton business, and the Southerners were going north for business purposes and for education. And so this is how William Grimes is somehow spotted or recognized from time to time. So shortly after that ordeal, William Grimes begins to write his story. From letters that have been preserved at the Litchfield Historical Society and newspaper clippings, we kind of get a good sense that William Grimes wrote his story fast. It may have been taking him 5 to 8 months to get it done. And for a man who just picked up the bare bones of reading and writing, that was quite a feat. So nothing that I had ever read about slavery prepared me for the explosive text that is William Grimes. This is his 1825 slave narrative. It is housed at the incredible Beinecke Rare Book and Manuscript Library. When I saw it for the first time, when I held it in my hands, I was so emotional, just as I am emotional now. William Grimes was savvy enough to write his story and to write it without any sort of assistance, but yet it's raw. It's episodic. It's all over the place. I find myself still going back and forth, trying to make sense of his life, trying to follow the storyline. And I had to desensitize myself from the horrific beatings. Everything was about the beatings, the whip, the scars, not just the physical ones, but the mental ones as well. So I needed an expert. I needed someone to help me make sense of this narrative. I came across a book called To Tell a Free Story. the first century of Afro-American autobiography from 1760 to 1865. That incredible, groundbreaking book, which is still so important today, was written by Dr. William L. Andrews, a professor from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. I reached out to him, but he was the only living scholar to write anything about William Grimes. He was very gracious. We developed a relationship over time, and he approached me after I shared information with him. He approached me about teaming up for a new edition of the Grimes narrative, and we did that in 2008. If Bill were in front of you today, I know he's in the audience, he would want you to know how precedent setting this narrative is. And so I've learned this from Bill Andrews. William Grimes, at a time in 1825 when African American autobiography was rare, William Grimes penned the first fugitive slave narrative in American history. The Life of William Grimes, a Runaway Slave, came out 8 years before the Anti-Slavery Society was formulated. The American Anti-Slavery Society came out before they were even thinking about their involvement in the production of slave narratives. William Grimes' book came out before the famous abolitionist William Lloyd Garrison had even started the Liberator newspaper. This book came out before Freedom Journal, the first African-American newspaper in the history of this country, which came out in New York City. William Grimes, and this blows me away every time. William Grimes was the first person to go through slavery in the South and write about it. I want you to wrap your head around that. The first person to go through slavery in the South and write about it. So it's the first time we are hearing about slavery from the perspective of one who lived it rather than from the perspective of the enslaver. William Grimes was also the first to write about how hard it was for a Black man to earn a living, to live a life in the so-called free North. There are other things that make William Grimes' book remarkable. One, that this is straight from Bill Andrews. I could not have known this. I learned that famous fugitive slave narratives that were the trademark of the abolitionist movement of the 1830s and 40s, the 40s and the 50s, they were picked up, of course, by the abolitionist movement, but they were also edited by, corroborated by, sometimes ghostwritten by white people. I learned from Bill that William Grimes' book is a work of literary independence, which means that he had no white involvement to craft, to shape, to form his narrative. So he wasn't a writer. He didn't really know how to formulate his book. He's just writing, telling one grim story after another. What else is interesting about William Grimes, and it speaks to his business savvy and acumen? He didn't just write his book, he also registered it with the District of Connecticut. He did that for historical posterity. And one scholar by the name of Susanna Ashton believes that he may have been the first African American to apply for a copyright on his book under the 1790 copyright law. That needs further exploration, but it is astounding that this man would have this tenacity, this drive. And I'm sure it had to do with he being in the intellectual circles of New Haven and Litchfield. Another remarkable find that came to existence or surfaced years after the 2008 edition of the Grimes narrative was printed or published, I should say. William Grimes not only wrote his narrative, but he advertised it. He advertised it on October 9th, 1825 in the Connecticut Journal in New Haven. Unbelievable. And what you see on the screen is the actual preface taken straight from his book, addressed to the public. So very fitting to be in a newspaper that says to the public, because he wants you to know. He wants you to know his outrage. He wants you to know his story. He wants you to know that his property was taken from him. He wanted you to know that he had to purchase quasi-freedom, pseudo-freedom, for he was not really free, as he shows you in New England, in particularly Connecticut. And we do know that while he's here in Connecticut, slavery still exists. Slavery had not been wiped out in Connecticut until 1848, if I'm not mistaken. William Grimes is here. This is 1825. They still have slaves in Connecticut. But what's very telling about this piece that you're looking at is the very last line, way down at the bottom in fine print. He said that his book is for sale at the bookstores in this city. And this city is New Haven. Completely blown away. Completely blown away. So I needed to know what were the bookstores in New Haven, who owned them? Could I find this information? Well, here's what I do know. There was a very celebrated bookstore in New Haven at the time William Grimes is advertising his book. It was owned by Hezekiah Howe. And I found an interesting little write-up about this bookstore that said, Hezekiah Howe's bookstore in those days was one of the most famous in the country. Standing in the shadow of Yale College, it was the daily resort and gathering place of the learned men of that institution, and for those from many other localities who were temporarily drawn to New Haven through its attractions as a literary and educational center. Hezekiah Howe was a man of high culture and intellect, and an excellent authority on everything pertaining to books. It is said that in bibliography, he had no equal in the country. So this source came from actually a piece written about Hezekiah Howe's son, who was Henry Howe, a well-known historian. And this article was published in 1896. So I know of at least 3 other booksellers and book dealers in New Haven, but Hezekiah Howe was the most prolific. So whether Grimes's book was in that particular bookstore, it remains to be seen. We may never know, but William Grimes, and there's no reason not to take his word for it, says that his book is available in the bookstores in this city. But what this newspaper article does do, it puts William Grimes right in the heart of Yale and New Haven, not just as a servant, but as a man selling a book that has been registered with the District of Connecticut. And there is an advertisement in a newspaper for that as well. So William Grimes had a reputation in New Haven, and this ad puts him front and center in the heart of Yale's literary and educational scene. William Grimes wrote his book, or published, I should say, twice. Of course, in 1825, but again in 1855. Now, this book image that you see is from my good friends at the New Haven Museum, but it also is housed at the Beinecke Library as well. They own that edition, the 1855, as well as the 1825. But here's what we know about this edition. William Grimes was 70 years old when this 1855 version came out. He definitely states in his narrative that he needed to raise some money. Of course, we now know by 1855 what he looks like because his image adorns the cover. This edition is everything that the 1825 edition was, except it has an added chapter at the very end of the book. And that chapter was actually dictated to a gentleman by the name of, let's see, what is his name? Samuel H. Harris, who was a printer in New Haven. And I happen to know this because Professor Susanna Ashton from Clemson University actually located the newspaper document that states how the book came about. And that was actually part of an obituary that was written about William Grimes. So William Grimes died in August 21st, 1865, as I said earlier. When he died, he was written about in several newspapers. And the New Haven Daily Palladium of August 21st, 1865, speaks of a Yale reputation. They wrote, 40 years ago, William Grimes was the head of a prosperous barbershop opposite the colleges. All Yale patronized him, and thousands of Yale graduates knew him. A funeral announcement was also recorded that same day on August 21st in the New Haven Palladium that says, died in this city, August 21st, Mr. William Grimes, aged 81 years. Funeral arrangements on Thursday, August 22nd at 11 o'clock a.m. from number 50 Carlisle Street. Relatives and friends are invited to attend. William Grimes was laid to rest in the Grove Street Cemetery. This is the family plot. On the front, you see family names of Robert Cromwell, who is William Grimes's brother-in-law. On the right of the screen, where all the shrubbery is, you will see the names William Grimes and Clarissa Caesar. The wreath that you're looking at was placed on a beautifully historic and celebrated day in September 15th of 2018, when William Grimes was ceremoniously inducted in the Connecticut Freedom Trail. The novelist James Baldwin once said, "I want American history taught. Unless I'm in the book, you're not in it either. History is not a procession of illustrious people. It's about what happens to a people. Millions of anonymous people is what history is about." Well, William Grimes refused to be anonymous, and I refuse for him to remain anonymous too.